Welcome, friends, to the APUSH Dig, where we will build together a critical understanding of U.S. history through analyzing the processes of change. Now that we've explored all of the essential big topics of AP U.S. history, it's time for us to do some big picture review. Today, we turn our attention to the theme of politics and power throughout U.S. history. We will examine how political beliefs have changed as the nation grew, fell apart, and was put back together again. In order to achieve this, we will be traveling through time, exploring the concept of American politics and governing throughout the 9 AP U.S. time periods. Well, from 1492 to 1607, it doesn't make much sense to talk about American politics yet, so onward to politics and governing in time period 2, the colonial era. All 13 colonies existed at the pleasure of the British Crown, so ultimately political power over the colonies resided in London. The Crown issued and maintained authority over the colonial charters. However, London is very far away from North America, so local forms of governance developed under the approval of the King and the British Parliament. In New England, the town meeting was an early form of direct democracy in which every member of a congregation was expected to vote on local issues and participate in civic affairs. In the southern colonies, like Virginia, an aristocracy of the planter elite dominated all aspects of political economy and society. In governing institutions such as the House of Burgesses, a system of representative democracy only for the wealthy, worked with a colonial governor appointed by the king. The first major change in governance in America can be seen with the Revolutionary Era. After over a century of local governing institutions and a policy of salutary neglect from the Crown, the colonies had mainly governed themselves. With the British and colonial victory in the French and Indian War, the King and Parliament decided to drastically change their relationship towards the colonies by tightening their grip, ending the period of salutary neglect. Much attention is placed on the implementation of taxes over commodities such as sugar, tea, lead, etc., and the rebellious refrain, "No taxation without representation." But of equal, or to some historians greater, importance is the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. White settlers were meant to reside east of the line, and the native peoples of the Ohio River Valley, now considered by Parliament to be subjects of the British Empire, were to maintain the land west of the line. The colonists were outraged by the perceived tyranny of this act. After all, the colonists were the engine of the settler colonial project, and land was their fuel. To restrict their access to land was an existential threat to their settler identity. The Articles of Confederation was the colonists' first attempt at having a written plan for government to keep the 13 disparate colonies united, although this unity was very loose. The Articles outlined a plan for a weak central government, thus allowing the states to maintain a great deal of sovereignty and autonomy. But a major economic downturn and developments such as Shays' Rebellion sent up red flags to the American elite. A stronger federal government would be needed to better ensure a nation consisting of 13 separate states could continue. The Constitution was written by the economic elite of 12 of the 13 states, and after an intense debate between its supporters, dubbed the Federalists, and its opponents, most creatively called the Anti-Federalists, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. The constitutional era begins with the election of George Washington as the first president. The last major political development of this time period is the formation of the first two political parties. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, were admirers of the British system of a strong central government and rule by the elite. Their rivals were the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, who stood for a small central government, the preservation of state sovereignty, and an anti-elitist outlook. In period 4, we see the Federalist versus Democratic Republican conflict end with clear Jeffersonian victory, as the Federalists disappear after the War of 1812, and the era of good feelings marked 3 decades of Democratic Republican rule. The good feelings were most emphatically ended with the election of Andrew Jackson and the evolution of the Jeffersonian Democrats into the Jacksonian Democrats. Jacksonian democracy means the common male shall rule, a direct strike at the Hamiltonian notions of the nation needing a civic-minded elite to oversee its governance. In this era, we see universal white male suffrage enacted state by state. Just as the Democratic Republicans formed as a dissenting party to the Hamilton-Washington-Adams Federalists, The Whigs, led by the anti-Jackson Henry Clay, were formed in opposition to the Jacksonian Democrats. In time period 5, we see the U.S. do what all empires do. They expand to the point of fracture. But unlike many empires of the past, the U.S. was able to form again with the superglue of Lincoln's expansion of the power and role of the federal government. As the nation expanded westward, the same question arose: would slavery be allowed to expand as well? And in each time this question was posed, American politicians tried to sidestep it by agreeing to a series of compromises, band-aids across a bleeding jugular. A new political party forms, the Republicans, the first anti-slavery mass political party. The Republican Party stood opposed to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. Though many abolitionists did flock to the Republican Party, as a whole, the party did not necessarily stand for ending slavery, just ending its expansion. The election of the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, and his clear objection to the continuing spread of slavery was the excuse the Southern planter slaveholding elite used to justify their articles of secession. Lincoln refused to accept secession and used all the powers the federal government could muster to defeat the slaveocracy of the Confederacy. This most effectively ended the political debate between states' rights and the federal government. Since the federal government wins, the nation continues. Federal government power continues its growth after the Civil War during the Reconstruction period. Slavery is abolished and citizenship is extended to the former slaves. Further, the right to vote will be extended to black men. However, as with many aspects of federal power in this era, extending a right to black people did not always mean protecting that right for black people. Time period 6, the end of the 19th century, aka America's first Gilded Age. Federal Reconstruction ended in 1877 when President Hayes agreed to remove federal soldiers from the South, setting the stage for the white Southern Redeemers to resume their fascist stranglehold over Southern society. During the Gilded Age, the active federal government of Lincoln and the Reconstruction Republicans recedes, to be filled by... Who were the presidents of this era again? All right, this is an era of weak federal leadership. But don't think that means that the government was not involved in anything in this era. It was. This was the era of a cemented bond between the government and big business. It won't be the last time we see this in our history. There are 3 political phases to time period 7: the Progressive Era, Gilded Age Part 2, the 1920s, and the New Deal. During the Progressive Era, both Democrats and Republicans believed that government could be an effective manager for the nation and help to redirect it after the capitalist excesses of the Gilded Age. It's important to note that progressives were a wide net, and these politicians were not on the same page when it came to how government can best manage the nation, but they all did agree that government had a clear managerial role to play. Progressivism was killed by World War I, and in the desire of the laissez-faire Gilded Age Part 2 Republicans of the 1920s, their return to normalcy and to let the business of America be business. This worked out great. Oh wait, no. It created the conditions for a massive economic collapse, the catastrophe we call the Great Depression. In comes Democrat FDR and his New Deal, and a major political change in the U.S. Progressivism comes back, but now it's turned up to 11. New Deal liberalism did not only have the progressive view that federal government should manage the nation. New Deal liberals believed the government had to provide relief for individuals, ignite recovery for the national economy, and work to reform capitalism, not end it, in order to prevent a future depression. Because of the New Deal, the Democrat Party became the party of working peoples and led to the migration of black voters out of the Republican Party. Time period 8 is post-war America, Cold War America, Civil Rights Rebellion America. Politically, New Deal liberalism continues. Truman succeeds FDR and pushes for and comes close to winning universal health care. The Republicans come back to power for the first time since 1932 in 1952 with the Eisenhower election. However, Eisenhower expanded New Deal programs like Social Security. He did not challenge them. New Deal liberalism morphs into LBJ's Great Society. The election of Republican Richard Nixon in 1968 is definitely a conservative blowback against liberalism's supremacy, but Nixon was a disappointing conservative. He continued New Deal, Great Society liberalism by establishing the Environmental Protective Agency and OSHA. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 prohibited any attempt at suppressing the vote. Gone were the poll taxes and literacy tests of Jim Crow America. Now, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, America could actually be the liberal democracy it had always thought itself to be. Finally, on to time period 9, our America. If Nixon was the disappointing conservative, Reagan was the king conservative. His election, his re-election, and the election of his vice president, George Bush the Elder, to the presidency are all historical attacks on New Deal, Great Society liberalism. Reaganite Republicans rebelled against taxes, against feminism, against social spending, and the culture of rights. The war on poverty was ended. The war on drugs was born. The era of mass incarceration was baptized. In 1994, Democrat Bill Clinton was elected, but supporting my claim that we've all been wading in Reagan's waters, he moved to cut social spending welfare programs and passed a draconian crime bill. This marked the rightward leap of the Democrat Party. The new Democrats are not FDR liberals. They became, with air quotes, nicer, kinder Reaganites, a party married to Wall Street, just like the Republicans. In reflection now, here are the periods of the greatest political change in our nation's history. The Revolutionary era of the 1770s saw the ultimate challenge to British colonial authority. The constitutional era of the 1780s and 90s saw the triumph of a federal system of government over the sovereignty of the states. The Jacksonian era of the 1830s witnessed the vote being extended to all white men. Reconstruction, 1860s and 1870s, saw the federal government take an active role in trying to recreate Southern society by ending slavery and extending citizenship to over 4 million black people. The Progressive era of 1900 to 1918 birthed the notion that government could be a good manager of the nation. The New Deal consensus from 1933 to 1972 saw the federal government become actively involved in the economy in order to provide security for the most vulnerable Americans. And the Reagan Revolution of 1980 through today has been trying to eradicate all of the victories of New Deal liberalism. Some final thoughts on politics and power in U.S. history. The desire to free themselves from the economic and geographic restrictions of Great Britain were the motivation for creating the United States. The desire to create a stable and strong central government that could protect property rights and promote interstate commerce was the motivation for writing the Constitution. The expansion of voting rights to include all Americans is not truly protected until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And finally, the periods of a liberal and active federal government are few and relatively short in U.S. history. And that's all, folks. See you next time.